Good morning, Tracey. Thank you so much for joining us on Politically Aware.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
To kick things right off, would you mind explaining briefly to our viewers what Just Share does and what shareholder accountability is all about?
Just Share is a non-profit shareholder activism organization. So we're the only NGO in South Africa using shareholder rights and powers to focus exclusively on corporate accountability, particularly corporates in the listed sector, and specifically around climate change and inequality. Listed companies, large companies play a huge role in our society. Obviously, there's a huge positive aspect to this role. They employ people, they pay taxes, they create many of the goods and services that we all use. But there's also a negative impact. These companies have significant environmental impacts. They emit a lot of carbon, greenhouse gases, and the way they treat their workforces has a big knock-on effect on inequality overall and how that manifests in the country. So importantly as well, big corporate players also have enormous influence over government policy. But this is something that's fairly poorly understood in South Africa because there's no transparency around this interaction. So Just Share uses research and analysis, advocacy and activism to shine a light on corporates and what they're doing and the impacts that they're having on our society, and to drive their shareholders and regulators to hold them accountable for the negative impacts and the costs that they extract on the country.
Thank you so much. And in your many years of experience trying to hold Sasol accountable, what are some of the common mismatches you've found between what the company tells its stakeholders, whether the shareholders, whether the media, or through its advertising messaging, that don't match up to the business plans and actions that the company actually puts into place?
You know, Sasol always has a good story to tell about itself, and it takes every opportunity that it can to remind its stakeholders and the broader public of its status in the economy as a very large employer, as a very large taxpayer, as a company that makes products that we all use and need. But that's really only part of the story. Let's remind ourselves that Sasol was established by the apartheid state. To quote a recent report by the think tank TIPS, building Sasol Secunda was a massive state intervention that distorted the economy. Taxpayers subsidized the company enormously then, and we continue to do so today, even though it's a private listed company. The company also still has enormous influence over government policy, especially in relation to climate change, air pollution, and the carbon tax. Secunda is the world's largest single-point source of greenhouse gas emissions, and Sasol's annual carbon emissions are bigger than those of many small countries. Sasol Secunda also emits enormous quantities of toxic air pollution, things like sulfur dioxide, so that's something different to greenhouse gases. And these emissions have catastrophic impacts on surrounding communities. It has vast coal mining operations which have polluted soil and water and air for decades. It also produces, as you probably know, a huge variety of plastics, which are contributing to the global plastics crisis. So in short, Sasol's climate, environmental and social impacts are actually devastating. But because these are not financially quantified, and because the company is so good at telling a positive story about itself, the government and Sasol shareholders have really, for the most part, just ignored these issues and ignored the communities that have suffered as a result. Sasol is the master of spin, is probably the best way that I can put this. And it has successfully convinced the government and the financial sector that it is too big to fail. Its corporate reporting, its advertising, its sponsorship, think bird books, soccer teams, etc., are all very cleverly designed to create an image in the minds of the public of a responsible corporate citizen who cares about the environment and cares about the people that it impacts. But the reality on the ground is really very different.
Sasol's lost a lot of value lately, and yet it's seen as so central, as you say, to investments, to pensions. Do you think this might start to change?
Well, I think it's safe to say that at this point in time, Sasol's shareholders are in a very tricky position, especially those with very large holdings, like the Public Investment Corporation and the Government Employees Pension Fund, who are supposed to hold investments on behalf of their members that are able to provide them with retirement benefits long into the future. These big shareholders have exercised far too little oversight of the company's strategies and plans to decarbonize in particular, and they have failed to hold the board and management to account. As a result, these shareholders are now in a situation where they've invested large sums of their clients' money in this company, which is just consistently losing value. Selling out now would mean, of course, enormous losses for their clients. And so Sasol's investors seem to be hoping against hope that at some point in the near future, the share price will recover and the company will start to become profitable again. But it's also starting to dawn on some of these investors that if Sasol really is going to be a different kind of company in the future, one that can survive the transition to a low-carbon economy and thrive in a very different world, that this will inevitably require further short-term financial pain. So we've got a classic stranded asset conundrum on our hands for these shareholders.
Could you briefly explain what a stranded asset is?
Well, what a stranded asset is an asset which is facing mounting financial challenges, burdens, costs because of our transition to a low-carbon economy, which steadily erodes its own value and its own ability to create value for its shareholders. And in fact, I think we've seen that play out very clearly with Sasol over the past 3 to 5 years.
You, as Just Share, participate in the AGMs. You ask the tough questions around this value loss. Is there accountability, responsiveness?
It is very rare to get a straight answer out of the company's management and board of directors that really meaningfully addresses questions about the company's climate and environmental and social impacts. Sasol has an absolute smorgasbord of words and phrases, vocabulary that it uses when it describes its impacts and when it describes its targets and strategies. Words like optionality, flexibility, optimizing value creation opportunities, future Sasol, Sasol 2.0, etc., etc. All designed to create an impression in our minds that there's a lot of important stuff going on here. When you try to interrogate the meaning of those words, there is no detail and no clarity on what its plans are and how it meaningfully plans to address these challenges. And Sasol shareholders should have been interrogating that detail, demanding answers, demanding that those gaps be filled in, instead of rewarding the company for incremental improvements and disclosure.
Does Sasol's leadership structure enable or hinder accountability on this aspect, especially regarding the social and environmental issues that you've brought up?
Well, the problem with, of course, executive tenure and executive remuneration is that it is all based around short-term incentives. Companies reward their executives with basic pay packages and then short-term incentives and long-term incentives, but long-term incentives generally are around 3 years. So, long-term is only in the financial and corporate sector is 3 years considered to be a long-term time frame. So that was one of the key aspects of Sasol's climate transition plan that civil society highlighted at the time, was that the first point at which there could be any accountability was 2026, which was far too far away to enable shareholders to ensure that the company was making progress. 2030, of course, none of the people who are leading Sasol now are likely to still be there in 2030, especially if you look at the leadership churn that's been happening at the company recently. Another indication, I think, of all of the issues that we're talking about here today. So it's very difficult to hold a company accountable for a long-term strategy if you're only willing to do so when you get to the end point of that strategy. So the fact that shareholders are not demanding answers and holding the company accountable now for its failure to provide those answers simply allows it to get away with continuously kicking the can down the road.
What do you think we should be hoping for from Sasol? What's the best way forward?
Well, I don't think that this narrative about Sasol shutting down and the economy being crippled is a helpful way to look at the problem. First of all, that is very much Sasol's rhetoric, and it is what it loves to hear other people say, because that is part of the "we're too big to fail" narrative, which is really a narrative aimed at saying, don't put any pressure on us. Don't push us. Don't make us do anything different because you will suffer. And we really, as a country, completely fail to interrogate that narrative. As I've said before, we focus entirely on how Sasol contributes to the economy, but we ignore all the costs it imposes on the taxpayer, on communities, on the climate, on our environment. Sasol has never paid any of these costs. And now, when it's coming to crunch time, when it has failed to prepare and failed to adapt to the world around it, it now wants more special treatment from government and shareholders to help it escape from its current self-imposed challenges. So we really should be having, before we can discuss any solutions, we need to be having an honest conversation about all of the public goods that Sasol extracts from our economy for free. The public goods that it has been taking for 70 years out of our natural capital, out of our human capital, out of our economy, and directing into profits for management and shareholders. Sasol will just continue to distort the market and distort the economy as it fights for its survival. That is its primary goal in all of this, is Sasol's survival. Not the rest of us, not the environment, and not the climate.
And in that survival, it's a battle of narratives in my experience. They're going to say, well, we provide the fuel, like a third of all the fuel that gets people around. Today, that's how cars move around. What are you going to do? But at the same time, we know about that disingenuous lobbying, everything done possible just prevent the transition needed to clean mobility, more public transport, more active mobility, everything that could help bring our emissions down, right?
Yes, well, I think, that is a narrative that's playing out around the world. And as we know, one of the main reasons why government action on climate change remains so woefully inadequate compared to what we need to do to address the climate crisis is precisely because the fossil fuel industry has spent decades pushing very clever narratives about how it's not their responsibility, it's our responsibility. We're the ones who drive, we're the ones who smoke. I mean, it's a very similar thing to what the tobacco industry did, way back when, before all of these things were exposed. We have a personal carbon footprint. You fly, I fly, we drive our cars. So what can we do? We're just the fossil fuel industry providing you with these wonderful products. But exactly as you say, what isn't disclosed is those companies' roles in in increasing regulation on them that would force them to reduce their emissions, and in slowing down the kind of government policy and law and regulation that we need to replace those products. I mean, look at South Africa's position on electric vehicles. We have made barely a single stride. I think I heard on the radio the other day that 900 EVs were sold in South Africa in the whole of 2023. 900. And there is an ideological government position that undoubtedly and unquestionably is influenced by fossil fuel industry lobbying. So this is not an even fight. It's not a level playing field. And we're all duped by it all the time. And unless we have a plan for how these entities are going to transition themselves either out of the economy altogether or into something very different, there is going to be a catastrophic collapse.
That's very concerning. I'm actually getting chills. So what solutions do we have here, Tracey?
Regulation is key here, right? We need a meaningful carbon tax. And these shareholders really need to escalate their engagement with Sasol so that we can start seeing some accountability. Coming to regular concerned citizens, of course, many regular concerned citizens are also shareholders. So they should be demanding answers from the people who manage their money about why they are invested in Sasol and what those managers are doing to ensure that this company isn't allowed to continue to operate in such a way that is essentially a sitting time bomb in the midst of our economy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tracey Davies from Just Share.
Thanks, Steve.